Brevini, asking, is AI good for the planet? And also, how is AI transforming universities, and what should universities do? I'm Professor Sarah Bannerman, Canada Research Chair in Communications Policy and Governance at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. McMaster is located on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee First Nations in the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Dr. Brevini is Associate Professor of Political Economy of Communication at the University of Sydney. Before joining the Academy, she worked as a journalist in Milan, New York, and London. And she's the author of several books, including Is AI Good for the Planet?, News Corp, Empire of Influence, Amazon, Understanding a Global Communication Giant, Public Service Broadcasting Online, and she's the editor of several books, including Beyond WikiLeaks, Carbon Capitalism and Communication, Climate Change and the Media, and she's currently working on a new volume for Polity entitled Communication Systems, Technology and the Climate Emergency. The Critical AI Talks are organized by my colleague, Associate Professor and University Scholar Andrea Zafiro and I, and are supported by the Department of Communication Studies and Media Arts, McMaster's Vice Provost Teaching and Learning, and the Faculty of Humanities at McMaster University. The field of communication studies really speaks to the history of information and communication technologies and their politics, whether it's the rise of the printing press and the ways that that changed society, all the way to how the internet, social media, and now AI are changing individuals, societies, and our politics. A second-year online asynchronous undergraduate course will be open to all undergraduate students at McMaster Level 2 and above starting in the winter term next year. That course is called CMST 2AI3 Generative AI, Human and Societal Impacts. In the first part of our conversation, we'll review some of the key ideas from Dr. Brevini's work, asking, is AI good for the planet? And in the second half, we'll speak to how AI is transforming universities and what universities should really do in this situation. Questions can be submitted to the YouTube chat. In order to do that, you need to be logged in to YouTube, signed into YouTube, and you need to be subscribed to the Humanities channel of McMaster University. Welcome, Dr. Brevini.
Thank you so much.
For those who haven't read your book, Is AI Good for the Planet? And it's an excellent, excellent read. I just want to overview in the first part of our conversation some of the ideas from your work, starting with just the question, what are the environmental harms of artificial intelligence?
Yes. So first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really honored and very pleased to have this opportunity of really to reach out to a Canadian audience of people that are very active and I know care very much about these issues. We know that the debate in the media has changed radically in the last 5 years. And when I was writing the book and collecting materials of the book, there was barely any debate about the environmental impact of AI. And this is something that, of course, is something that we need to keep in mind, and we can go into that very soon. But I think it's crucial to start with the definition of AI to understand how, for me, it was important to understand the type of technologies that AI represented in relation to the climate emergency. Because the thing is, in public domains, in public debates, for years, and let's remember that AI is a product of the 50s, you know, I mean, it's not a product of 2020. The definitions of AI always focus on this idea that it could mimic human cognitive skills. So the idea that it's a machine that is able to reason, to learn, and to do problem solving even better than humans. So, and this is again, and even today, after starting and kicking off a debate in the last 7 years, I would say a huge take-up of debate, also with certainly an emphasis on generative AI, what is really crucial is that this definition of machines that mimic human cognitive skills is really not very helpful in understanding it in relation to the climate emergency. So for me, the starting point of the book was really to find a definition that could be useful to connect it to the climate crisis and to remember that as communication scholars, we are pretty much, like sons and daughters of our time, because we are suffering under the climate emergency and we need to be able to relate communication questions to this emergency we're facing. And so in order to do that, I've been looking for the right definition. And, obviously I just had to decide what would be my definition. And I drew a lot on the tradition of political economy of communication. Why did I do that? Because political economy of communication traditionally looks at communication systems as machines, as infrastructures. And of course, if we adopt a definition that then transforms our understanding of AI into something that is really an assemblage of material devices, infrastructures that per se is capable of depleting scarce resources in their manufacturing, in their usage, in their disposal, then you can see that there is a much more logical connection to the climate crisis. Okay, so this is only the starting point, obviously, of our conversation. And you can see for the students that, are learning about political economy of communication, you can see a kind of a Marxist focus, so the connection of and the understanding of technology as a social relations, so technology by using Williams' tradition, one of the most famous cultural critique in Britain, it's always in a full sense social. And this means that, of course, it's embedded and reflects and it's shaped by the economic, by the political factors and major systems of capitalist production. So, of course, starting from this perspective, then we can start and look at answering your question. What are the environmental impacts? What are the environmental arms of AI? So when we start from this definition, then we can see why it is important to look at the entirety of the global supply and production chain of AI to understand really the complexities of this environmental harms. Because otherwise we tend to follow the recent and most recent media reports only talking about the electricity and the energy impact of data center. And what I really want the students to learn and the public in general to be aware of is that we're talking about something that is actually much bigger, something that is really embedded in our system of production and consumption, okay? So if I have the time, and I would like to mention then how we can start to understand this. And in order to do that, I developed this concept that I call the eco-political economy of AI. And I think we have a slide for that.
Could we put the slide?
I think that the political economy of AI, the eco-political economy of AI, is an helpful concept because it highlights the need, theoretically and empirically, to understand the different segments that are included in the global supply chain of AI. Now, for the students that are not so familiar with definitions that come from political economy, I think just to simplify, it's important to remember that the production chain of AI is just a series of steps that turn raw materials and data into services that we use. And obviously it starts with the rare minerals and the metals that then, for example, like lithium, for example, like cobalt, then we use to build the hardware. And, for example, the famous computer chips of NVIDIA that are always in the media now. And of course, then at that point, data is collected and it is fed into these computers where it's processed by complex algorithms that train AI systems. And of course, teaching them how to perform different tasks, the tasks that we know, translating, understanding speech, recognizing faces. And only at that point, then the trained AI is embedded into devices, apps, devices, and then the users start interacting in what is called the inference phase. But then we have to remember that these objects are then discarded, because when they reach the end of the life, they need to be disposed of. And of course, they become what we have been calling in communication studies digital rubbish or e-waste. And each step of this production chain, from mining materials to processing data to digital waste, is part of this global AI production chain. And each of the segments will need to be checked against the idea of, are they sustainable? Is this step sustainable? How it is carried out? And so if we get the first slide, for example, on the first segment of the eco-political economy of AI, we start, of course, always with the rare metals that we need to dig in order to control, in order to develop AI. Now, I'm sure that many of you are very familiar with, for example, the famous salt flats of the Atacama Desert in Chile. Like, these traditionally are considered to be places where we go, for example, to dig our lithium, for the famous batteries that are, empowering our devices. At the same time, we know what are the damages, the damages for the land. We know this because of indigenous, for example, traditions, indigenous studies, anthropology studies that have shown the struggles also of indigenous groups and local community to actually try to protect their land. So very often the environmental cost of this are extending, to the pollution, that comes from the mine, the toxicity of some of the materials that are used for extracting, for example. And, we know also from the slide that you're seeing that the cobalt has been considered a war mineral. And we know very well, unfortunately, because we live not only in a climate crisis, but also during a war crisis. And we know how relevant the control of resources, such as this type of rare metals, is becoming in the geopolitics. So this is why the eco-political economy of AI matters, precisely because we're talking about power, which is embedded in the social relation that technology is. So then we move into the second stage. And the second segment with slide 3 is, I think, something that probably many students will be very familiar with, because it's constantly in the media, the problem of the training of AI. And the problem of the electricity and the water, the data centers where this training happens are consuming. And of course, like in this context, we know that we have compared to the first segment of the political economy of AI and the third, we have a lot of data, actually. And the data are saying a few things. They're saying that according to the energy, for example, authority that has done this very famous report on data centers, we see that the increment and the incredible consumption has now become on a trajectory to be more than double in 2030. And for example, I was looking at the more than 300 data centers that you have in Canada. And again, this is generating a huge debate across the country and across the states about how are we gonna find the energy, to sustain these data centers. And very often the question on, do we need these data centers and do we need to expand at this level, is something that gets discarded. But as we will see later on during the lecture, we see that there is also resistance that is emerging. The other thing is, for example, one of the other data that I always find very interesting is that in terms of this type of consumption, we see that the United States are, of course, leading with 45% of this demand, and China and Europe are actually at 25% of the entirety of this consumption, and Europe at around 15%. And I think these data are incredibly relevant for us to understand what we talk about when we discuss also the carbon emission and the impact in terms of the environmental cost of AI. As you can see in the slide, what I try to do is to provide, no, it's the same slide with the segment 2. Yeah. I tried really to provide the equivalence of the consumption and the carbon emission of AI. Now I used the study that was one of the pioneering studies done by MIT at Amherst on one very classic model, LLM model for translation. And back then, when the study was done, it was certainly one of the first one in which they attempted to understand the cost and the environmental impact of the training. And I think that actually it is fascinating to see the extent of the quantity of carbon emission that one basic language model can produce at about 284,000 kilograms of carbon emission. And I was, very keen, to see and to show what this means in terms of flights, for example, a flight to Rome, a flight to New York. And you can see from the data how staggering the difference is and the quantity we're talking about. And actually I have to say, these calculations that were done back in 2019-20 are still very relevant, but the situation got even worse with the complications and the complexity of neural networks that are now used especially for generative AI. And let's also remember that at the moment, many scholars, and especially coming from engineering or computer science, they are focused on trying to establish the extent of the impact of the environmental cost of the inference, because inference means we are interacting as users with these models, and the production and the usage of electricity and water is still increasing and can be even higher than the energy used for the training. And this is just the second segment, that we need to worry about in terms of the environmental cost. And then we move to the last one. And the last one, I think it's also particularly, problematic because we saw an incredible increment of the amount of digital waste. And for this, we had very useful reports coming from the UN, seeing, the staggering 80% of increase. And why is that? Well, clearly, this type of acceleration is leading to the type of hyper-consumerism that, will lead us to constantly choose the newest iPhone, constantly choose and discard the old ones. And these are all decisions that have been forced on us because of very clear decision against obsolescence that have been taken by the digital lords of developing AI at the moment. And of course, if you believe that actually there is a right to repair and that you want to repair your iPhone instead of having to move to the new model and having to discard the model, anytime you're taking the decision, you need to think in terms of where is my digital device going to end up. And I'm telling you, unfortunately, the brutal power relations of colonialism are replicated precisely in the business and the economy of digital waste, because like Europe, for example, does not discard and keep this digital waste within the European Union. Why? Because the rules for health hazard are much higher than, for example, states in the global south. So, for example, one of the biggest digital dump of the world is Nairobi. So, a lot of your devices will end up in Nairobi, for example. Some of them will end up in Bangladesh or in Cambodia from Asia. And so what are the costs for the environment of the transportation of these devices? What are the costs of having to secure these devices that are highly toxic and are toxic for the community and for the kids that then have to live in this area? And so, of course, all these questions. So a very long answer to your first questions, but I thought that this was really important to kick off the debate, because otherwise we tend to think that once we found a solution for the issue of energy and the consumption of data centers, then we are fine with AI, then we can move on and not worry anymore.
Thank you so much. That just brings the full context in, and it just sort of, so often you hear about almost like you're looking through a small lens at what the environmental harms are, because you hear about how much water or how much energy, but you've really put this into a much bigger context and a whole economy structured around the production, use, and disposal of AI. So thank you. I want to then ask the next question, which is, are there benefits? Are there environmental benefits that could be achieved through AI? Is there hope that AI might become more sustainable, or that we'll achieve sustainability through AI? Or is that something we can hope for?
I actually think that it is important always to move forward with hopes and trying to make the conditions and the organization of production better, right? And for this reason, for example, I'm often asked about, Professor Brevini, what about, for example, sustainable AI application? And this word AI for sustainability is becoming quite common, for example, in some of the biggest sector where AI is used to make the environment better. So, for example, the classic of biodiversity monitoring, where you have a camera that analyzes and traps recording and footage and satellite imagery to track endangered species. And it's useful in terms of the collection of data and the habitat changes. Like another of my favorite that I love to discuss is the optimization of crops, so the so-called smart agriculture. We have a lot of AI introductions and applications that are actually helping crop management. We have smart energy management at every level, in urban context and in farming context, and we have a lot of climate modeling as well, right? That are used also to make predictions about fires and so on. The problem is that they are called AI for sustainable applications, but nobody is ever running any type of quality assessment on to what extent these applications have an environmental footprint. So in order to actually assess the environmental benefit, we should actually start with an assessment of what are the risks and environmental risk. Because you could argue that a lot of the predictions, for example, on the changes to the environment that generate bushfires, and logging in from Australia today, Australia is a country that has been dealing for centuries, for its entire history, with bushfires. But indigenous people had precisely the type of understanding to constantly manage bushfires. Are they better than an AI system that can be used to track and to control bushfires? We never know exactly until we do and we run a very serious environmental impact assessment. So, I think actually the other point that I want to make, besides the category of sustainable AI, is that there are some applications that are used, for example, in hospitals, in health, and the idea, of elaborating these data and producing patterns, for example, for cancer research, is a very old idea. And so the idea that we need such incredible amount of computer power to run this type of checks and to run these pattern recognition applications is actually not completely accurate. So the point again would be, do we need this type of neural networks to achieve the success of some of these technologies that can bring to, like a better recognition in advance or certain type of screening, in medical research or in health research? I think what is really crucial here is always to be able to run a benefits cost analysis of what we are, embracing on, but with the environment in place in the first place. And at the moment, it's really not happening. We are just assuming that the type of development we are seeing, which is dictated just by a few digital lords of the West and digital lords of the East, are actually what we need. We are told what our needs are, and we can't really participate in the debate very much.
Super briefly, you use that term digital lords a lot. Could you just briefly explain what that means?
Yeah, it's one of my personal, I think, personal academic battle. I am not someone that likes the word of the big tech or tech giant, because tech giants and big tech would entail an entire different set of achievements by these corporations. Let's remember that these corporations were able to succeed because of massive public investments that came through defense and universities in generating and launching the internet. And I think that the idea of big tech is always often obfuscating, you know, the history of the internet and how these digital lords have become as powerful. They've become as powerful because they had the privilege to use public infrastructure generated networks and then capitalize on the scale and also big and massive network effects. And let's remember that at the time in which digital lords were starting to develop, there was a time in which we as society, especially the US, but also Europe, like could have decided, for example, to develop and to just enforce antitrust laws that we had in order to avoid the generation of monopolies. Like, in very basic liberal economics, we're not talking about welfare states, we're not talking about social democratic economic models, we're talking about basic liberal economics. Monopolies are market failure. So if we have only monopolies that serve a particular type of service, then regulation is a must. And these are the basics also of the Chicago School. So I'm not talking about a welfare Scandinavian democratic model of economics. And we actually decided not to intervene. And so we generated these big monopolies. I call them digital lords because I think that the metaphor is a very useful one to understand the intricacies of the ideological, economic, political, and social power these entities are. And as we know in the West, they have such power that they are capturing decision-making on shaping and developing AI, but they're also capturing decision-making on shaping decisions that are geopolitical decisions that are very relevant. Think of the current international war zones and the way in which these instruments are used constantly and every day as experimenting. And, and these are, again, major economic investments and major financial investments. And these are decisions that are taken. I mean, this type of lords don't develop in vacuum. They develop only when you have enabling lack of regulatory infrastructures. So for me, it is important to remember that these are not neutral platforms. And this is why I criticize the use of platforms to refer to major digital lords, because it takes away the idea of the dominance of the power and the concentrated power that they show.
I want to move to that topic of regulation and kind of get more into that. You've pointed out that antitrust law was there along with many other types of regulation to kind of limit and balance the power of segments in society to ensure that monopolies in the private sector didn't become too powerful for government to overwhelm government. And you're speaking to some of those transformations that are happening where digital lords have been able to have such influence in government, partly because they're important sources of knowledge, but they've been able to sell their own visions to government and the sort of idea that tech must be used in all of these and is the vision of progress and the way forward and everything. You've mentioned antitrust, and you've got some other interesting regulatory proposals. One, skipping back to something you said earlier, where you said we need to kind of make better judgments and fuller judgments about the adoption of technologies and whether they're worth the environmental costs. And one way that you point out in your book that could be done is if those costs were labeled and made more transparent, if there was a system for measuring those costs, and then an ability to decide based on that knowledge which AI apps are worth the environmental degradation that they will certainly cause. Could you speak about that, and if you've got other policy proposals or other advocacy, maybe we could work that in as well, responses to this important environmental crisis.
Yes, I mean, I can tell you, Sarah, that a few years ago, as I was giving talks about these topics, there was a very different climate of hope, especially because we thought that some of the sustainability goals also issued by the UN were still reachable. And we thought that, let's remember that the latest IPCC report is reminding us, and I want the students to keep reminding this, because sustainability and the climate crisis have disappeared from the media after the take-up of the Trump administration. So, like, there was one of the major warning of the IPCC was we need to reduce the carbon emission by 60% compared to 2019 by 2030, okay? And I mean, this 2035. And this is actually something that should make us really think in terms of, okay, we need all governments, we need a global governance to really impact and really follow the pledges that were made with the famous Paris Agreement. Now, the US leaves the Paris Agreement again in the second Trump administration, and simply we don't even discuss these issues anymore, despite the fact that we saw in the last year an increment of weather events, cyclones constantly. You see a cyclone in the south of Italy for the first time in Sicily in the history of the country. You see, and very often these weather events are not really connected to the climate crisis. Now, like a few years back, we saw that there was an effort also coming from the corporate world to address this issue within the corporate responsibility framework. So sustainability efforts were labeled under these ideas. And even in California, for example, so even in the US, where now the debate has been completely shut down, there were transparency initiatives that would demand for corporations to constantly report on their carbon emission. And that, of course, is the type of law that impacts very seriously data centers and factories developing, and working on these devices. And that, for me, is a crucial step within the eco-political economy of AI. In my book, I obviously also refer to the idea of a carbon footprint label, because once we determine that devices powered by AI, and we know all devices at the moment are powered by AI, they, of course, rely on the global supply chain, then we need, through transparency initiatives, to demand for each of the segment what is the environmental impact. So, for instance, if you decide to buy your smart refrigerator that is powered by AI, you need to know that this is produced with this amount of energy and water, that this will be discarded in a certain specific place of the world, the cost for the transport of discarding this, and also how sustainable like the type of refrigerator would be. And all of this should be implemented within a carbon footprint label that will be attached to every device. I've been asked if this was not too consumeristic as an approach, but what I keep saying is that we are in presence of an eco-political economy of AI. Every kind of initiative that we can implement to help also citizens make the right choice are very important. And another example, for example, was to remind the students of the cost of water and energy of any time they have an interaction with ChatGPT, for instance. And I have brilliant students that after using generative AI for 3 years, they're now coming to me and say, we gave up GenAI in our mobile. And I just said, so why is that? Is it because of my lecture on the environmental impact? And they said, well, yes, but it was giving us anxiety. And I was saying, why was it giving you anxiety? Because we realized that after 2 years, we couldn't write a text without GenAI anymore. And so very smart students realizing the impact on their cognitive skills and not just being reminded of the intensity of the environmental exploitation connected to AI, which leads me to the need, especially for our institutions, for university institutions, to really invest in what I call the green tech literacy, the green AI literacy, which is different from the AI literacy that big digital lords are selling at the moment, but our own literacy. And for this, I saw very important campaigns that have been run across different campuses. For example, one very close to you at the University of Toronto, the Save the AI, that invited students to show, for example, how they could save the AI by stopping drinking. So, because it was AI consumes so much water that anytime you have an interaction with ChatGPT is about half a liter of water. Do you want to stop drinking so you can feed and support your AI? And I found that this type of campaigns, and we will have a link soon to the campaign on YouTube, are incredibly crucial to really engage our students, because many of them are asking us, so, and now what can we do? And yes, a lot of it is regulation. Yes, a lot of it is policy. But we also have to intervene with major programs, for example, educational programs that would start at the elementary school, because these students start being embedded in digital devices very early in their lives. And so the earliest they know what is the environmental impact of their digital interaction, the better it is also to have an informed citizenry. So obviously, these are a variety of different toolkits. I can also speak of the failure of the AI Act in Europe to consider the environmental impact assessment. And the hope we have that in the implementation phase that is currently going on, we can have more discussions. But for example, in Europe, I was talking to colleagues in Italy, in Belgium, you still have serious reporting restrictions, which are still there. And so it would be important and crucial for data centers and for developers of AI to do serious reporting. But if we don't push these initiatives, the industry will not start reporting about their emissions. So it needs to come from a coordinating policy and regulatory effort. And I think in terms of hope, we have a variety of initiatives in mind. We just need to have the political ability to implement them. And they are absolutely crucial because, for example, we talk very often about, and I'm moving more towards a discussion about universities, but universities are often faced with the decision, should we adopt AI, and critically, should we just go for these tools? Very often I see that it is because of the way in which digital lords are sending, armies of PR and lobbyists to sell products. But then I would invite university to think in terms of how are we making these products sustainable within campus, and therefore maybe think in terms of a more serious digital sovereignty within the university, start being more independent from these big global conglomerates. That, of course, is another solution to reduce the emission and to aim for more sustained sustainability.
I think the question of the role of university is just so important, and thank you for bringing that up. I also want to ask Colin if you could put that URL in the YouTube chat for us for the really cool campaign that was done at the University of Toronto. The role of universities, and you just raised about how it's important for universities to we have a fairly significant, interesting role in society because we've got all these academics who have the room to imagine things differently. We're not just another corporation. We have the ability to set models. University students have the ability to think creatively about new approaches to undertake, in some cases, not all students have the capability or capacity, but to undertake campaigns like the one that you saw at the University of Toronto. In communication studies, we also teach about media and social media and activism too, and a lot of the techniques that can help to fire campaigns and make them effective. But I see also a sort of transformation within universities, even of how IT works, with the centralization of IT around specialized IT units, where faculty are less involved. Where this is a situation where there might be faculty with very relevant research to the decisions being made, and also a perspective in terms of how universities fit into broader society, and the potential that universities have to think differently than corporations about AI. And there's sort of like some shifting ground that's happening there that affects our potential to be able to do those things and to have some academic freedom or academic sovereignty, including over the way IT is the infrastructure of universities, thus shaping the politics of universities. So I really appreciate that you raised all of that. One of my concerns is, you mentioned in your book the concept of Techno-Solutionism. And I sometimes worry that universities are almost acting as a mouthpiece of Techno-Solutionism. Could you say a few words, just a few words about what Techno-Solutionism is, and how that we might be seeing that?
Yes, I'm obsessed with the word Techno-Solutionism, and I see, well, in very simple terms, Techno-Solutionism is an ideology that leads us to believe that any problems in society has a technical solution. And it's a very easy way to look at reality, right? I mean, you have endemic racism, endemic slow violence towards indigenous groups, you have wars, you have the problem of the climate crisis, and with the, to use David Harvey's word, a techno fix, you can just avoid addressing the major, deeply rooted societal, economic, and political questions that will lead to social change. So in a way, this is a type of ideology that has been completely pushed, especially in the US throughout the 80s, and then, of course, again, also adopted during the Thatcher era in the UK very much, and then it found the 90s with the launch of the internet to be the guardians of Techno-Solutionism too, like the super information superhighways will sort out every problem we have with democracy. I'm sure you remember all these slogans from Negroponte saying the hand of history, and now the internet is setting us free. And we know very well already, because we know we have a history of Techno-Solutionism failures. And so we know that the internet promises, because of the progressive privatization of something that was public, has led not exactly to the best solution. You know, we have digital lords constantly being called to Congress for mental health, the dreadful mental health impact on kids, and huge problems with misinformation, with disinformation, and now AI has just multiplied these problems. And so, like, because we have an history of the failures of Techno-Solutionism, one has to wonder, why is it that when universities are struggling, faced with the same kind of problems, like sustainability is a major issue for university, having wars are major issues for universities, the lack of funds, the decisions of many governments around the world to defund public institutions, these are major grave crises. And so instead of relying, especially on communication scholars, I wouldn't say just all scholars, but especially communication scholars, because we come from a very interdisciplinary perspective and we understand communication systems within this system of political, economic, and social embeddedness of relations. And so, like, they, instead of developing a task force that has humanities scholars involved, social scientists involved, to make an assessment and to try to understand why is it that the university should follow the industry in the AI race. Who said that, right? what is the role of university in 2026? So this is the big question, right? Like, if you believe, and we still believe, that universities have to act as guardians of knowledge, have to act as places of freedom where we can express our opinions, but we can also develop the kind of critical thinking that can help us shelter ourselves from the condition of crisis in which we're living. Some people talk about polycrisis, but the fact that we can't really trust the information that we are served, for example, during a war, for example, during a major climate calamity, well, that is a crucial problem, especially like from our perspective of communication scholars. And so like the crucial thing, it would be not to follow a tech solutionistic and tech deterministic agenda. And instead of saying, what can AI do for society? What can AI do for a university? To reverse the question, which is something that I've done in the book that hopefully will come out very soon, in which I question the values of an artificial society. So the artificial society is a society that at some point decides the university don't have the same role of developing critical thinking. And obviously, you can argue that this argument is pushing the boundaries of university, but is it really? Because if we start from the perspective that we ask, what is the type of society we want, then we know what is the role of university in 2026. And if we start from the perspective that the role of university is to teach and equip students with the tools and the cognitive skills to be able to develop critical thinking and to also shape the students for a world that is particularly difficult at the moment, and to be able to make sense, to give meaning to the world, to be informed, opinionated citizen, and to be able to participate. You know, it was all about giving them the tools to participate in a society, in a democratic society. So if we still believe in these values, then the question is not how can we use AI? The question is, how can we make sure that our students in 2026 are still able to summarize a text, being able to deliver an oral presentation, being asked questions, answer questions, read and focus on a text, and being able to convey the text to you. Now, this should be the test for our students. I call it a cognitive function text, in which we want to secure that by the end of our BAs, students can still do this, right? So if this is the objective of university, then everything that comes next about AI will have to be discussed as not the urgent priority. So and very often we are facing in everyday teaching with the situation where managers from universities are telling us, oh, AI is not so bad and students should know how to use it. Students know how to use it. It's the simplest thing ever, but the problem is, why should universities advise our students to embrace products that are only produced by digital lords, that have failed us many times before in terms of the major scandals of misinformation? So why should we trust them now? We already know the problems with biases of this type of LLM systems. We already know the problems, for example, of copyright, the violation that they led to. So to what extent universities don't start from an analysis of what are our aims and what can AI do to help? I think it would be much simpler.
You talk a few times in your book, there's a few topics I want to quickly cover. We've got not too long left. You talk about data centers and their costs. Many universities are setting up data centers. One question is this the wrong direction for universities? Briefly, because I wonder if you could also answer another question, which is about something you were also sort of just alluding to, academic washing or academic capture, which might be one of the reasons why universities seem to often fall for some of those techno-solutionist ideas, or lose sight of the big picture of the problems that are caused by the technical solutions that might be good on a small scale. I want to try to touch on both of those two issues in the last few minutes if we can.
I'll address them together, okay?
Sure.
So we start from the bigger picture. Like, why is it that there is a problem with academic washing, especially within AI research, right? It is connected, of course, to the political economy of, in which we are living, right?
Could you define academic washing to begin with, just for those who haven't heard that term?
Of course. Yes. Well, academic washing, we can understand it as a form of, attention towards being very optimistic about AI research, because very often they are also funded in their research by the same industry that are supposed to be analyzing, right? So anything about greenwashing means that we are selling, interventions that are actually not particularly useful to the environment with the green frame, right? So we do indigenous washing if we use indigenous people to sell, for example, something that is now happening very frequently to convince community about data centers necessity, for example. So we use these terms in this way. And, for academic washing, the idea, of constantly being funded by the industry leads to a situation where even if the reports, even if the studies are not completely aligned with industry aims, there is a sort of self-censorship happening, because you can't really criticize as much as the funder. It's a very old problem of academic research and a very old problem in political economy. And actually, I think that because of the major scandals that have, unfortunately happened and have been discussed specifically with AI research. We had Yochai Benkler, who is certainly not someone that comes from a Scandinavian welfare social democratic approach, to say it can't, academics have to stop being completely controlled and captured by the industry. And so, this is, of course, it's a major issue, because we see politicians being captured by the industry. So it will be important to have an independent voice, an independent set of voices coming from the academy. So for me, when I see, and I was just invited to launch a new critical AI center in the UK, and they asked me, what is the first question? What is the first policy? What is the first thing that you would do? I would say, well, the first thing is that you can't take money from the industry for this research. It's simple as that. You call yourself a critical AI center, you have to be independent. And so that in the context of the political economy of AI that we are living, right? And obviously, you see, in this context, that very often you will see, if you have very strong relation with industry funders, then preferably and very likely you will, and look at, honestly, I will invite all the students to look at where the signatures and where these deals have already been signed with major digital lords. For example, Oxford, University of Oxford running into a deal with OpenAI. That's Microsoft, okay? Seeing major universities in the US in a great deal with the digital lords on AI, also generative AI, instead of developing their own systems. So for me, I see that there is a connection also between the level of research and this type of deals, because of course, we know how path dependency works. We know how discourse is generated, conversation on campus, conversation between researchers and deans and management. But I actually look at these initiatives where universities are trying to develop their own data centers with great hope. So, for example, in Scandinavian countries, you see the question of sustainability taken much more seriously. And you see universities that are saying, we don't need the neural networks, complex systems that Amazon is pushing on us. We don't need this. We need only, these storage facilities and this capacity that we can develop by ourselves. And then we can run open source software on this that are much more sustainable. And for this, there is like decades of research done in software studies and in computer science to show how to save energy also by using open source software. But at the same time, also we develop data centers that are using smaller scales systems that consume much less, and we make them sustainable because we know the water that can be used, that we have solar panels and we produce them in a different way. But also we become sustainable, and we reaffirm our digital sovereignty in times of wars and in times of crisis, because we want to be able to be functional also in times of major crisis. And so the idea of the smaller scale, the idea of the local, the idea of not surrendering just to the digital lords is a very precious one. And I actually think it obviously depends on the agreements that you have. You know, sometimes the agreements are just with local developers, just with sometimes are with other big corporations that will dictate also how much energy is used. And, you know, it would be very important for university to reclaim this space and reclaim this power. And the students are always on board on these initiatives because the students know and care very much about the environment, very much about sustainability. And so bringing the conversation around sustainability on campus and extend the conversation on campus on these issues is absolutely crucial. You'll be surprised by, you know, I've been associated with an American universities for years, and, you know, and of course an Australian university. You'll be surprised by how little of the sustainability reports of university include data centers, include storage devices, and high-intensity computer. It's like technology doesn't have an environmental footprint. We are still there in sustainability reports. So it is absolutely our role as academics and the students to be heard in this context and to do something better, because the opportunities and possibility are there for us. And I think actually the results will be, you know, much more conducive to hope. And we need hope at the moment.
We sure do. There's one question in the chat that I wanted to ask you. This is from a viewer on YouTube. Do you have any advice to help on how to help promote to others anti-AI or stopping the use of AI?
So to promote others.
Yeah,
Can you repeat the questions?
Yeah,
so
asking kind of for advice to students, I think, on how to kind of help the effort of stopping other people from using AI, or maybe stopping institutions. I'm not sure which is meant, but.
Well, I think actually the question really indicates the need to have very common and very also simple workshops on campus, and green AI literacy on campus, where the students are really invited also to co-design this type of interventions, where we are teaching them what it means, you know, to be using a specific type of device in a certain way. So, for example, one of the examples that I'm always bringing is like to give to the students, or to give also to young people, you know, up to 18, a monthly carbon footprint consumption target. And in that way, basically, the students will know, okay, I've been using a video game for 7 hours today, and this cost me this type of carbon emission because I used it on mobile. If I used it at home at my grandma's place, I would have saved in terms of energy and water consumption. So, you know, I would like the students to be able to make this choice, because they would, and they would participate. Like the joke around the Save the AI campaign was, are you there to sacrifice yourself from drinking to support the data center? Well, obviously that's a provocation. And the solution is really also to teach them. But we have to start by teaching them. They don't even know about the cost for water of an interaction with ChatGPT. But when they do, they start behaving in a different way. So I think actually it's really a matter of running these workshops, coordinating them at the level of the university, but across disciplines. Because I've run a study with engineers and people that are using high-intensity computer on different campuses around the world, and they don't reflect so much about this. But the moment in which we are telling them about this, they immediately have solutions to save their energy in their practice as engineers. Isn't that beautiful? So, you know, obviously these are all part of this idea of green AI literacy that we need to push on campus, and it is crucial for our students for sure. So we just need to start doing it.
I want to thank you so much for your contributions, your books, your work on this subject. You've been one of the people who has really taken this subject forward, really saw earlier on how important this is. And I want to thank you for that work you've done and for speaking to us today.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah. Today we've been speaking with Dr. Benedetta Brevini, asking, is AI good for the planet? And also, how is AI transforming universities? And what should we do about it? A second-year online asynchronous course available to McMaster undergraduate students, level 2 and up, will start at McMaster next year in the winter term, called CMST 2AI3, Generative AI, Human and Societal Impacts. I want to thank Dr. Brevini, McMaster's Vice Provost Teaching and Learning, the Faculty of Humanities, the Department of Communication Studies and Media Arts, my colleagues, and the wonderful technicians who have supported these critical AI talks. I'm Sarah Bannerman, speaking with Dr. Benedetta Brevini.